So here's something they don't teach you in Sunday school. According to one ancient text, a text that was sitting in a cave near the Dead Sea for 2,000 years, only 10% of the demons currently active on planet Earth are actually loose. The other 90%? Chained up, waiting, held back until something called the tribulation period kicks off, and then they get released all at once. Now, stop and think about that for a second, because if that's true, it means the spiritual warfare you and I deal with right now, the stuff that keeps you up at night, the temptation, the oppression, whatever you want to call it, that's only 10% of what's coming. That's the trickle before the flood. Where does that number even come from? It's not in Genesis, it's not in Revelation, it's from a book called Jubilees. And if you've never heard of it, you're not alone, because for about 1,700 years, almost nobody in the Western world had either. Grab a coffee. This one gets weird fast. Let's start with the basics, because you need to know what you're actually holding before we get into the good stuff. Jubilees goes by a few names. Some call it the Little Genesis. Some call it the Book of Divisions. The Ethiopians, who are the ones who actually preserved it for us, called it the Apocalypse of Moses. And that last name is the key to understanding the whole book, because Jubilees isn't a brand new story, it's a retelling, what scholars call rewritten Bible. It takes you from creation all the way through the Exodus, covering the same ground as Genesis and the first part of Exodus, except it fills in details that Moses apparently left out the first time. And here's the claim the book makes about itself, right in chapter 1. Moses goes up Mount Sinai. He's already received the 10 Commandments and the law, and then, according to Jubilees, an angel called the Angel of the Presence starts dictating additional material to Moses. Not a new law, a commentary, a behind-the-scenes track, if you want to think of it that way, filling in what happened between Eden and Egypt, chapter and verse, using a very specific structure. Everything is organized into blocks of 49 years called Jubilees, which is exactly where the book gets its name. Now, whether you buy that origin claim or not, that's between you and your theology, but you can see immediately why it was popular. People have always wanted the extra details. Genesis tells you Cain killed Abel. It doesn't tell you what weapon he used, what happened to Cain's descendants in detail, or how exactly Noah's grandkids figured out medicine. Jubilees tells you all of that. It's the ancient world's version of the deleted scenes and director's commentary. So let's get into the part that made this book famous, or maybe infamous, depending on who you ask, the angels. You've probably heard of the Watchers if you've watched anything else on this channel, the angels who, according to the book of Enoch, came down to earth, looked at human women, and decided they liked what they saw. Jubilees tells basically the same story, but with its own flavor. In Jubilees, these angels weren't dispatched to earth to cause trouble. They were sent down originally to teach humanity, to instruct people in justice and uprightness. That's the assignment. And somewhere along the way, they went rogue, started intermarrying with human women, and the result was a category of beings the text calls Nephilim. Here's where it gets specific, and this is the part most people skip over. Jubilees doesn't just say there were giants. It breaks the pre-flood giants into different classes based on size and origin, tracking how the offspring of these angel-human unions kept growing more corrupted and more monstrous with each generation. By the time the flood comes, God isn't just dealing with wickedness in the abstract. He's dealing with a biological and spiritual contamination problem, and the flood is presented as the cleanup operation.
But the flood doesn't end the story, and this is the detail that gets me every time I read it. When the giants are destroyed, their bodies die, but their spirits don't just vanish. They become what the text calls unclean spirits, what we would call demons. And this is where that number I opened with comes from. According to the account, 9/10 of these spirits get bound and locked away, waiting for judgment. But 1/10, Noah actually pleads for this because he's worried about how his descendants will survive without any protection or testing. 1/10 is left loose in the world, under the authority of a figure the book calls mastema, to tempt and corrupt humanity until the appointed time. Sit with that for a second. That means, according to this ancient reading, the demonic activity we experience today isn't the main event, it's the leftover 10%. The rest is sealed until the tribulation period, when, according to Johnson's reading of the material, the whole reserve gets released at once. That's a heavy claim. And we're not done with Mastema yet, because he's about to become one of the most important characters in the entire book. Before we get to him, though, I need to open a door I'm not going to walk through yet, because there's a piece of this puzzle that's even weirder than the demon math, and it involves something Noah supposedly wrote down. We'll get there. Hold that thought, because it connects directly to why ancient people believed certain plants and herbs had spiritual power, and honestly, it's one of the strangest passages in the whole book. Later. Right now, let's talk about the calendar, because this is the hill Jubilees is willing to die on. If you remember one thing about Jubilees other than the demon percentages, make it this. This is a book obsessed with time, not in a vague philosophical way. I mean obsessed with the actual math of the calendar, to the point where the author goes out of his way, repeatedly, to attack anyone using a different system. Here's the setup. Most ancient calendars, including the one that became standard in later Judaism, tracked months by the moon, 12 lunar cycles, with adjustments needed every few years to keep things lined up with the seasons. Jubilees says that's wrong, dead wrong. According to the text, God's actual calendar runs on 364 days a year, split into 4 even quarters of 91 days each, with each quarter breaking down into 3 months. Why 364 and not 365? Because 364 divides evenly by 7, 52 weeks exactly. Every date lands on the same day of the week every single year forever. No drifting, no guessing, no needing a priest to announce when the new moon happened this month. The author doesn't just present this calmly either. He goes after the people using lunar calendars, warning that they'll mess up their festivals, disturb the appointed times, and throw the whole religious calendar out of alignment with what heaven intended. This wasn't a minor technical dispute for these people. It was, in their eyes, the difference between worshiping God on the days he actually set apart and accidentally worshiping on the wrong day entirely. And here's why this matters for us, sitting here in the present day, scrolling past this on YouTube. When archaeologists cracked open the caves at Qumran in 1947, they didn't just find fragments of Isaiah and the Psalms. They found fragments of Jubilees, 15 separate copies, which tells you this community was reading it constantly, wearing out their scrolls and needing new ones. And they also found calendar documents from that same community running on the exact same 364-day system. The group that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls had split off, in part, over exactly this kind of calendar dispute, refusing to worship at the Jerusalem temple because they believed the priesthood there was keeping time wrong. Ken Johnson's angle on this, drawing from his broader work on the Qumran community and biblical prophecy, is that getting the calendar right isn't just trivia. If ancient prophetic timelines were built around a fixed, mathematically clean 364-day year instead of the messier lunar solar calendar most of us assume was standard, that changes how you count things like the 70 weeks of Daniel or any other numbered prophetic sequence. It's not just about when to celebrate Passover. It's about whether we've even been doing the math right when we try to calculate end times timelines at all.
Okay, Mastema. Let's go back to him, because I promised you, and because this guy shows up at some of the most pivotal moments in the whole Old Testament story, playing a role you were never told about. You know the story of Abraham and Isaac, the binding, the mountain, the knife, the ram in the thicket. In Genesis, the text just says God tested Abraham. It doesn't explain the mechanics. Jubilees does. According to this account, it's Mastema who goes to God and essentially dares him to test Abraham's loyalty, insisting Abraham only loves God because everything's going well for him. It's the same basic move Satan pulls in the book of Job, needling God into allowing a test, except here it's framed explicitly as Mastema's proposal, and God's response is to let Abraham prove him wrong. That's not the only cameo. Later, when Moses is heading back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, there's a strange little moment in Exodus 4 where God apparently tries to kill Moses at a lodging place along the road, and Moses' wife, Zipporah, saves him by hastily circumcising their son. It's one of the most confusing passages in the whole Torah. Why would God try to kill the guy he just commissioned? Jubilees steps in and reassigns the actor. It wasn't God doing the attacking, it was Mastema trying to take Moses out before he could even get started, and the circumcision is what drives him off. See the pattern? Mastema is Jubilees' answer to a question a lot of careful Bible readers eventually ask. Who's actually doing the tempting, testing, and attacking in these gaps in the narrative? The book takes ambiguous or unattributed actions in Genesis and Exodus and puts a name and a face on the opposition. Whether or not you think that's accurate, you have to admit it's a fascinating window into how a Second Temple Jewish community was already wrestling with the problem of evil and looking for a coherent villain behind the scenes, centuries before the New Testament gives us a fuller picture of Satan's role. Let's rewind further back to Abraham as a young man, because Jubilees gives him an origin story Genesis never bothers with. In the Bible, Abraham basically just appears. God tells him to leave Ur, and he goes. Jubilees fills in the why. According to this account, Abraham grows up surrounded by idol worship, and at a young age, he starts quietly reasoning his way out of it, noticing that the stars and the sun and the moon can't actually control the weather or the harvest the way people claim, and concluding there has to be one creator behind everything, independent of the idols his own father makes and sells for a living. Eventually, this leads to a dramatic moment where Abraham burns down a house full of idols, an act of open rebellion against the religious system he was raised in, and one that puts him at odds with his own family before God ever formally calls him. It's a compelling character arc. It gives Abraham agency and intellect instead of just having him show up as a passive recipient of a divine command. And it also sets up something Jubilees cares deeply about, the idea that true faith has always required actively rejecting the false systems around you, not just passively inheriting whatever religion your family practices. That theme carries all the way through the patriarchal narratives, and it's part of why the author keeps circling back to covenant markers, especially circumcision, which Jubilees treats with an intensity that goes beyond what you find in Genesis, insisting it has to happen exactly on the 8th day, no exceptions, framing any deviation as a serious covenant violation rather than a minor procedural detail. All right, time to circle back and open that door I left cracked earlier, because this next part is the kind of detail that sounds like it belongs in a fantasy novel, except it's sitting in an ancient religious text that a real community once treated as important enough to copy over and over. According to Jubilees, after the flood, demons start attacking Noah's grandchildren, causing sickness and death among them. Noah prays about it, and in response, angels teach him medicine, specifically how to use herbs and plants to heal the afflictions the demons are causing. Noah writes all of this knowledge down in a book. But here's the twist. Mastema doesn't just let this stand. He convinces God to let him keep a portion of the demonic forces active, specifically so that human diseases and suffering can continue, arguing that if evil is fully restrained, humanity won't have anything to be tested against. So you end up with this strange arrangement where Noah has a book of divine medical knowledge, but the demons are still permitted a foothold in causing the sicknesses that knowledge is meant to counter.
It's basically an ancient explanation for why disease exists at all after the flood supposedly cleaned the earth, and why herbal medicine has this thread of association with hidden or forbidden knowledge running through so much ancient literature. Noah eventually passes this book down to his son Shem, and from there it supposedly continues through the righteous line. Whether you take that literally or see it as ancient symbolic storytelling, it's one of the clearest windows into how these ancient communities were thinking about the origin of sickness, medicine, and the ongoing tug-of-war between angelic protection and demonic interference in daily human life. Let's talk about Jacob and Esau for a second, because Jubilees does something with their story that catches almost everyone off guard the first time they hear it. In Genesis, the two brothers have their falling out over the birthright and the blessing. There's real tension, and then eventually, decades later, they have an emotional reunion where Esau runs to meet Jacob and embraces him. End of conflict as far as Genesis is concerned. Jubilees isn't satisfied with that ending. According to this account, the peace doesn't fully hold. Years after that famous reunion, Esau and his sons end up going to war against Jacob and his sons over land and inheritance rights, and it escalates into an actual military confrontation, complete with named battles and casualties, before Jacob's side wins out. It's a completely different emotional arc than the one you grew up with. Instead of a clean, tearful reconciliation, you get generations of simmering resentment that eventually boils over into open combat between two families who were supposed to have made peace with each other. It's the kind of narrative expansion that tells you these ancient communities weren't satisfied with loose threads. They wanted resolution, even brutal resolution, for every conflict Genesis left hanging. So here's the natural question. If this book was popular enough that people at Qumran were copying it constantly, if it was treating major biblical figures with this much added detail, why have you probably never heard a sermon on it? The short answer is that it got left behind. As Judaism and later Christianity solidified around what counted as authoritative scripture, Jubilees didn't make the cut in most traditions. It survived almost by accident in the Western world, preserved for centuries in the Ethiopic language by the Ethiopic Church, which kept it as part of their own broader biblical collection long after everyone else had forgotten about it. For a long stretch of history, if you wanted to read Jubilees, your only real option was traveling to Ethiopia and finding a monastery with a copy, which is exactly what an 18th century Scottish explorer eventually did, bringing manuscripts back to Europe and kicking off the process that eventually led to English translations. Then came 1947, and the caves at Qumran changed everything, because suddenly scholars had Hebrew fragments of Jubilees in hand, proof that this wasn't some late Ethiopic invention, but a text with genuine roots going back to Second Temple Judaism, written in Hebrew, read and treasured by a community that gave us the oldest biblical manuscripts we have. That discovery is what pulled Jubilees out of obscurity and put it back on the radar of serious scholars and researchers like Ken Johnson, who spent years working through exactly this kind of Dead Sea Scrolls material. Here's where I'll leave you. Whatever you make of Jubilees, whether you see it as a fascinating historical artifact, a window into how Second Temple Jews were thinking about angels and demons and prophecy, or something you'd rather leave on the shelf, the fact remains that this book was influential enough to shape how an entire community at Qumran understood time itself, understood evil, and understood their own place in a cosmic story that stretched from the Garden of Eden to a coming day of judgment. That's not nothing. That's a community that believed the details mattered enough to keep 15 copies of one book in a handful of caves for 2,000 years until the right moment came for us to find it. If you've gotten this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for, someone who wants the deep cuts, not the surface-level Sunday school version. Hit subscribe if you want more of Ken Johnson's research broken down like this, and I'll catch you in the next one.